It is 5 o'clock in the afternoon on September 11th, 1697. On the banks of the Tisza River, near a small Hungarian town called Zenta, 100,000 men are in the middle of crossing a river. Think about that for a second. 100,000 men. That's more people than fill most NFL stadiums today. Soldiers, cavalry horses, baggage carts loaded with food, weapons and treasure. All of them slowly, painstakingly funneling across a single makeshift pontoon bridge, one plank at a time. The air smells like mud, sweat, horse manure, and wood smoke from 100 cooking fires. Officers are shouting, animals are braying. It is loud, it is chaotic, and it is slow. And somewhere in the reeds and marshland, just a few miles away, 50,000 soldiers are watching, waiting, silent. Then, at exactly 5 in the afternoon, a cannon fires, and then another, and another, and then everything erupts. The Habsburg artillery, positioned with devastating precision, opens up on the pontoon bridge. The first salvos tear through packed masses of men who have absolutely nowhere to run. The bridge buckles, planks splinter, men and horses and supply carts tumble into the cold current of the Tisza. The screaming starts immediately. On the near bank, the bank where half the Ottoman army is still waiting to cross, the panic spreads like wildfire. Habsburg cavalry comes crashing through a gap in the outer defensive trench, the trench that was supposed to be finished but wasn't. Infantry hammers from the front. From the left flank, along the riverbank itself, another Habsburg column is cutting off every possible escape route. The Ottoman army, the most feared military machine in the world for the past 300 years, is being torn apart in real time. And then something extraordinary happens. Something that tells you just how completely this army has broken. The Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the entire Ottoman Empire, the man personally chosen by the Sultan to lead this campaign, is not killed by the enemy. He is killed by his own soldiers. His own janissaries, in a frenzy of terror and rage, cut him down on the battlefield. On the far side of the river, Sultan Mustafa II watches. He is completely, utterly helpless. The man who left Constantinople just months ago with the grandest invasion force his empire had assembled in a generation. He can do nothing but stand there and watch it all drown. By nightfall, approximately 25 to 30,000 Ottoman soldiers are dead. Thousands more have drowned trying to swim to safety. The entire artillery train of the Ottoman Empire's main field army, every cannon, every mortar, has been captured. And the Sultan's personal treasure chest, the physical symbol of imperial wealth and power, is now in Habsburg hands. On the other side of the ledger, the Habsburg army lost roughly 500 men, 500, against 25,000. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, how on earth is that even possible? How does a smaller army do that to a larger one? Who was the genius behind this? And why have I never heard this story before? Then you are in exactly the right place. Because the story of what happened at Zenta is one of the most extraordinary military upsets in the history of warfare. And the man who pulled it off is someone every history lover needs to know. But to understand September 11th, 1697, we need to go back, way back. The Battle of Zenta didn't just end a war, it ended an era. For nearly 400 years, from roughly 1299 all the way to 1683, the Ottoman Empire had been doing something no other power in history had managed to sustain for so long. It had been expanding, almost without interruption, into the heart of Europe. They took Constantinople in 1453, ending the Roman Empire once and for all. They swept through the Balkans, crushed Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and turned the entire eastern Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. By the mid-1600s, they were knocking on the door of Vienna, the Habsburg capital, the symbolic center of Christian Europe. And then, in 1683, they knocked on that door one time too many. The siege of Vienna failed. A coalition of European powers, the Holy League, counterattacked. And for the next 14 years, the balance of power shifted, slowly but unmistakably, against the Ottomans. But slowly is the key word. As late as 1697, the war was still very much undecided. The Ottomans were hurting, yes, but they still had enormous resources, enormous armies, and enormous pride. They were not going to go quietly. Enter two men who represent everything this story is really about. On one side, Sultan Mustafa II, a ruler who genuinely believed he could reverse the tide of history through sheer personal willpower. On the other, Prince Eugene of Savoy, a man born in Paris, raised in disgrace, rejected by the most powerful king in Europe, and burning with a ferocious ambition that would reshape the continent. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you love deep dive history like this, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know if it's midnight in Texas or 3 a.m. in California, because this is exactly the kind of story that keeps people up way past their bedtime. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. This is what we do. One man wanted to restore a dying empire. One man wanted to prove the world wrong about him. They were about to meet on the banks of a river in modern-day Serbia, and the world would never be the same. To truly understand what was at stake at Zenta, you have to understand what the Ottoman Empire was, and what it had been. At its height, the Ottoman military machine was, without exaggeration, the most formidable fighting force on the planet. The Janissaries, their elite infantry corps, were professional soldiers in an era when most European armies were mercenary mobs. The Ottoman cavalry, the Sipahi, was legendary. Their artillery, their logistics, their organizational capacity, all of it was ahead of its time. This was not some barbarian horde that happened to get lucky. This was a sophisticated, disciplined imperial war machine that had been winning for centuries. And winning matters. It builds momentum. It builds confidence. It builds the kind of institutional belief that says, we are the ones who conquer, we are not the ones who get conquered. For the Ottomans, expansion wasn't just a strategy. It was their identity. It was the organizing principle of their entire state. So when that expansion stopped, when the walls of Vienna held in 1683, when Polish King Jan Sobieski's cavalry broke the Ottoman siege in one of the most dramatic cavalry charges in military history, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was an existential shock. What followed was a slow-motion disaster. The Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia, counterattacked with a coordination that the Ottomans were utterly unprepared for. In 1687, at the Second Battle of Mohacs, the same location where the Ottomans had triumphed so spectacularly in 1526, the Habsburgs crushed them again, and Hungary began slipping out of Ottoman hands. Buda, the former Hungarian capital that had been under Ottoman control since 1541, fell to the Habsburgs in 1686. Belgrade itself, the gateway to the Balkans, was captured by the Habsburgs in 1688. Here's where it gets complicated, though. The Ottomans were hurting, but they weren't finished. France, yes, France, the supposedly Christian kingdom, was quietly supporting the Ottomans because Louis XIV didn't want the Habsburgs to get too powerful. And when Louis XIV launched his own war against the Habsburgs in the West, the 9 Years' War, it forced Austria to split its attention and its armies. Taking advantage of the distraction, the Ottomans actually managed to recapture Belgrade in 1690. So by the mid-1690s, the war had ground into something ugly and indecisive. Back and forth. Neither side was able to land the knockout blow. And then, in 1695, a new sultan took the throne. Mustafa II was 30 years old. He was educated, he was proud, and he was deeply aware that his empire was in trouble. He made a decision that no Ottoman sultan had made in a very long time. He would personally command the army in the field, not sit in Constantinople and receive reports. Actually, ride to war. His first campaign in 1695 actually went reasonably well. His second campaign in 1696 also showed some promise. The man had genuine personal courage. He believed, maybe he genuinely believed, that the presence of the Sultan on the battlefield would reignite the old Ottoman fire. His third campaign, in 1697, was supposed to be the definitive stroke. 100,000 men, the Sultan himself, a deep invasion into Hungary, and potentially all the way to Transylvania. If it worked, the Ottoman Empire would reassert itself as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. The losses of the past decade would be reversed. The empire would be saved. Now, I want to stop here and give Mustafa II some credit, because history tends to mock losers, and that's not entirely fair. This man was working with a deeply flawed institution. The Janissaries, who had been the empire's greatest strength, were becoming its greatest liability, politically powerful, corruption-riddled, resistant to modernization. The financial system was strained. The provincial governors were increasingly unreliable. Mustafa II wasn't an idiot who stumbled into disaster. He was a capable man trying to save an empire that was structurally struggling against forces he could only partially control. But he was also, critically, about to face a man who might have been the most tactically brilliant commander of the entire 17th century. Prince Eugene of Savoy was born in Paris on October 18, 1663. His father was the Prince of Carignan. His mother was Olympia Mancini, a niece of Cardinal Mazarin, one of the most powerful men in France, and a woman who had been, at various points, rumoured to be the romantic interest of the young King Louis XIV himself. In other words, Eugene was born into one of the most glamorous, politically connected families in all of Europe. And then his mother ruined everything. Olympia Mancini became entangled in the affair of the poisons, one of the most lurid scandals of the 17th century, a sprawling investigation into a network of poisoners, fortune-tellers, and alleged practitioners of black magic that reached all the way into the highest levels of the French court. Whether Olympia was actually guilty of anything remains a matter of historical debate. What is not debatable is that when the scandal broke in 1680, she fled France in disgrace, leaving her children behind. Young Eugene grew up under a cloud. He was small. Contemporaries described him as physically unprepossessing, thin, not particularly handsome, with a beak-like nose that caricaturists would later enjoy exaggerating. He was intended, somewhat half-heartedly, for a career in the church, but Eugene wanted to be a soldier. He'd wanted nothing else since childhood, so at the age of 18, he went to King Louis XIV and asked to be given a regiment in the French army. Louis XIV looked at this scrawny, socially tainted young man with the scandalous mother and said no. The king reportedly said Eugene would never amount to anything as a soldier, turned him away. Let me say that again slowly, because I want you to feel the weight of that moment. The greatest king in Europe, at the peak of his power, commanding the finest army in the world, looked at Eugene of Savoy and decided he wasn't worth a second glance. It was the most expensive mistake Louis XIV ever made. Eugene left France, went to Vienna, and joined the Habsburg army instead. He arrived just in time to fight in the relief of Vienna in 1683, his very first battle at the age of 20. And from that first battle, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that this man was something completely different. He rose through the Habsburg ranks with astonishing speed. By the age of 22, he was a major general. By 30, a field marshal. He fought in Italy, in Hungary, against the Turks, and against the French. He was wounded multiple times and kept fighting. He had an instinct for reading terrain, for spotting the vulnerable moment, for hitting the enemy exactly where and when they least expected it. He was aggressive in a way that distinguished him from virtually every other general of his era. An era when most commanders preferred slow, cautious sieges to decisive field battles. But here's what I think really defined Eugene, and this is my personal read on the man. He had something to prove. Not just tactically, not just strategically, personally. Every time he took to the field, somewhere in the back of that brilliant mind was the memory of Louis XIV's dismissal, the church career, the scandalous mother, the small nose that people mocked. Eugene of Savoy spent his entire military career proving that the people who underestimated him were wrong. That kind of motivation, that deep, personal, almost irrational need to prove yourself, can produce extraordinary things in extraordinary people. In lesser people, it produces recklessness. In Eugene, it produced genius. In July 1697, at the age of 33, Eugene was appointed commander-in-chief of the Habsburg forces in Hungary. The timing was terrible. Emperor Leopold I's war chest was completely empty. The army was underpaid, underfed, and badly disciplined. Eugene had to personally borrow money, literally take out loans, to pay his soldiers' wages and establish a functioning medical service. He requested supplies for 50,000 men and had to fight through Habsburg bureaucracy to get even that. And then, just to make things more interesting, he received his standing orders from Vienna. Emperor Leopold, I wanted to be very clear. Prince Eugene was to act with extreme caution. He was not to risk a general engagement. He was not to take unnecessary chances. He was to protect the Habsburg territory and wait. Eugene read the orders. He wrote back to Vienna with polite acknowledgement. And then he started planning exactly the kind of aggressive, high-risk operation that his orders explicitly told him not to do. Because Eugene understood something that the bureaucrats in Vienna didn't. Wars are not won by excessive caution. Wars are won by seizing the moment when it presents itself, and having the skill and the nerve to exploit it completely. The Ottoman army was large, yes, but large armies are slow. They're cumbersome. They have weak points. And if you could catch 100,000 men in the wrong position at the wrong time, he started moving his army south from Petrovaradin, quietly, carefully. He crossed the Tisza River and began moving upriver along the eastern bank, keeping his distance, keeping his presence concealed. His Serbian militia scouts, under the command of a captain named Jovan Popović Tekelija, were tracking every Ottoman movement. The Ottomans, meanwhile, had no idea where the Habsburg army was. Not a clue. This is genuinely stunning when you think about it. You have 100,000 men, a column that must have stretched for miles along the road, marching through countryside where the enemy army of 50,000 is following them at a distance, and somehow, the Ottomans don't know. Their intelligence was that bad. Their scouting was neglected. The enormous Ottoman war machine, for all its power, had a critical, blind spot. It couldn't see what was coming. Eugene could. The summer of 1697 was, for both commanders, an exercise in frustration. Mustafa II had left Edirne in April, and by the time he reached Belgrade in August, the campaign season was already burning away. The sheer logistics of moving 100,000 men across the Balkans, feeding them, watering the horses, keeping them supplied, was an almost incomprehensible undertaking. The army moved like a glacier. Powerful, unstoppable in the long run, but agonizingly slow on any given day. And once in Belgrade, Mustafa had to hold a war council. Where to strike? What was the target? This is where one of the critical mistakes of the campaign was made, and I don't think it gets enough attention. The governor of Belgrade, Amkazada Hussein Pasha, a capable and experienced commander, recommended attacking Petrovaradin. It was a well-reasoned suggestion. Petrovaradin was a major Habsburg fortress on the Danube, and taking it would give the Ottomans a genuine strategic foothold. The logistics were manageable. The risk was calculable. Mustafa overruled him. He decided to push north toward Transylvania instead. Why? Probably because Transylvania felt like a grander prize. It had been under Ottoman suzerainty for decades before the Habsburgs reasserted control. Retaking it would be a politically powerful symbolic victory. It would show that the Sultan's campaign wasn't just defensive. It was reconquering lost territory. But strategically, it was the wrong call. Pushing north toward Transylvania meant marching into terrain that Eugene knew well and that worked against the Ottomans' numerical advantage. It meant crossing multiple rivers. It meant elongating the supply lines. It meant, crucially, moving in a direction that would eventually force a river crossing. And river crossings, as we're about to see, were places where concentrated armies became extraordinarily vulnerable. The Ottoman army left Belgrade on August 18th, moved through the Banat region, demolished the abandoned castle at Titel, and began marching north along the Tisza. They crossed the river multiple times during the march, and through all of it, Eugene's army shadowed them, parallel, unseen. Eugene was waiting for his moment. He'd been waiting all summer. Every day that passed without a clear opportunity was a day of grinding frustration. He had 50,000 men ready to fight, and he was watching the Ottoman army march around Hungary like a visitor who'd forgotten where he was going. And then, on the morning of September 11th, 1697, everything changed. At dawn, Eugene's cavalry captured an Ottoman reconnaissance unit. Among the prisoners was a general, Pasha Kaffa, the commander of the Ottoman advance guard. Eugene interrogated him personally. What Kaffa told him must have felt like a gift from God. The Ottoman army, Kaffa explained, had begun crossing the Tisza near Zenta the day before. Half of the army, including all the cavalry, had already made it to the western bank. The other half, the infantry, the baggage train, the artillery, was still on the eastern bank, waiting to cross. The river crossing was happening right now. And critically, the defensive fortifications on the eastern bank were incomplete. The outer trench had a gap in it. The army was split, divided by a river, with its two halves unable to effectively support each other. Eugene listened to all of this and immediately understood what it meant. This was it. This was the moment. Now here is where the story gets genuinely remarkable, because of what happened next. While Eugene was absorbing Kaffa's intelligence report, a courier arrived from Vienna. A courier carrying a letter from Emperor Leopold I himself, reiterating his previous orders. Do not risk a general engagement. Act with extreme caution. Eugene was 33 years old. He was commanding the emperor's army. He had just received explicit orders from the emperor not to fight, and he was looking at intelligence that told him the Ottoman army was sitting in the most vulnerable position it had been in for years. He set the letter aside. He gave the order to attack. I've thought about this moment a lot, and I think it's one of the most consequential acts of insubordination in the history of European warfare. Not the most famous. Military history is full of generals who disobeyed orders. But in terms of consequences, this one has to be near the top of the list. If Eugene follows his orders, the Ottoman army completes its crossing, winter comes, both sides go back to their camps, and the war drags on, potentially for years. The treaty that eventually ended everything, the Treaty of Karlowitz, didn't happen in 1699. Austria doesn't consolidate control of Hungary. The entire trajectory of Central European history shifts. One man, one decision, one afternoon. Jovan Tekalia and his Serbian militia, scouts who had been monitoring every Ottoman move for weeks, now had the critical task of guiding Eugene's entire army through the marshes and boggy terrain that lay between their current position and the Ottoman camp. This was not a trivial thing. Moving 50,000 soldiers through swampy ground quietly, without alerting the enemy, in enough time to strike before dark. It was an operational challenge that would have defeated most commanders. Eugene managed it. By mid-afternoon, the Habsburg army had worked its way through the swamps and was forming up behind the Ottoman camp on the eastern bank. The Ottomans still didn't know they were there. Let that sink in. 50,000 soldiers had just crossed several miles of marshy terrain and were now deploying in battle formation within striking distance of 100,000 enemies. And those enemies had no idea. The Ottoman intelligence failure at Zenta wasn't a footnote. It was catastrophic, and it was about to cost them everything. Eugene surveyed the Ottoman position. He could see exactly what Kaffa had described. The cavalry was gone, already on the western bank. On the eastern bank, the infantry and artillery were still waiting to cross, packed together behind incomplete defensive trenches, with the river at their backs. The pontoon bridge, a floating structure of boats and planks, was clogged with men and carts trying to push across. The Ottoman infantry was in a killing ground. They just didn't know it yet. Eugene's deployment was precise. His artillery was positioned to fire directly at the bridge. His cavalry would drive through the gap in the outer trench. His left flank, under General Guido Starhemberg, would sweep along the riverbank to cut off any northward escape. The infantry would assault the defensive positions from the front. Every angle was covered. Every escape route was closed. He gave the order at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The Habsburg guns fired first. In an era before radio, before airplanes, before satellite reconnaissance, in an era where armies communicated by messenger and drum and the naked eye, the sound of cannon fire was often the first thing an army knew about a threat, and that's exactly how the Ottomans on the eastern bank of the Tisza first learned that 50,000 Habsburg soldiers were right behind them. The initial salvos were aimed at the pontoon bridge, and they were devastatingly accurate. The bridge, already packed with soldiers, horses and supply carts trying to get across, took multiple direct hits almost immediately. Planks shattered, support boats broke apart. Men and animals plunged into the Tisza River, which was deep enough and fast enough to be genuinely dangerous. The organized crossing became, within minutes, absolute chaos. On the bridge itself, there was no room to maneuver. Soldiers trying to push forward collided with soldiers trying to turn back. The entire thing became a crushing, screaming mass of panicked humanity. The Habsburg artillery kept firing. Each volley killed more people and deepened the chaos. At the same time, and this is the tactical brilliance of Eugene's plan, the cavalry moved. Habsburg horsemen found the gap in the outer defensive trench, the gap that Pasha Kafer had told Eugene about, the one the Ottomans hadn't finished digging, and poured through it. This wasn't a tentative probe. This was a full commitment. Eugene sent his cavalry through that gap like a fist through a paper wall, and once they were inside the outer perimeter, they had room to spread out, to flank, to drive toward the river. The Ottoman soldiers on the eastern bank tried to respond. They were not cowards. These were janissaries, professional soldiers with decades of experience, men who had fought across 3 continents. But they were in an impossible tactical position. Their artillery was on the other side of the river. Their cavalry was on the other side of the river. They were infantry, on foot, with the water behind them, fighting against cavalry that had broken through their perimeter and artillery that was tearing apart their only escape route. Some units tried to organize a resistance. Ottoman soldiers in the incomplete trenches attempted to hold their positions, but the trenches were designed to protect them from an enemy approaching from the north. The enemy was coming from the east, from behind, and the trenches that were supposed to be their shield were now just walls penning them in. While the cavalry was driving through the trench gap, General Guido Starhemberg was executing the left flank movement. And this was, in my opinion, the tactical stroke that made the entire battle decisive rather than merely costly. Starhemberg took his column along the Tisza riverbank, moving north. His objective was simple and brutal: get behind the entire Ottoman defensive position and cut off any possibility of the infantry retreating northward along the river. This maneuver, combined with the cavalry breakthrough from the east and the infantry assault from the front, created a textbook encirclement. The eastern bank Ottoman force was being surrounded on 3 sides, with the river, the very river they were trying to cross, blocking the fourth. Habsburg infantry now assaulted the main Ottoman defensive position from the front. The fighting here was fierce. The janissaries in the trenches mounted 2 separate counterattacks. They charged out of their defensive position and tried to break through the Habsburg infantry line. Both attacks were repelled. The Habsburg army held, absorbed the shock, and pushed back. On the bridge, the situation had gone from chaotic to apocalyptic. The original jam of soldiers trying to cross had been transformed by the artillery fire into a crush of panic-stricken men trying to go in every direction simultaneously. Some were still pushing west toward perceived safety. Others were trying to turn back east. Some had given up entirely and were jumping into the river. Habsburg cavalry had by now reached the bridgehead on the eastern bank, and they were doing everything in their power to prevent anyone from using the bridge at all. And from the western bank, from what was supposed to be safety, Sultan Mustafa II could see all of it. This is a moment I keep coming back to when I think about this battle, because there's something almost Greek tragedy about it. Mustafa II had staked his personal prestige, his empire's military credibility, and the lives of 100,000 soldiers on this campaign. He had ridden to war himself, which no Ottoman sultan had done in a generation. And now he was standing on the safe side of a river, watching his army die, and there was literally nothing he could do. His cavalry was with him, but cavalry couldn't swim a river in formation to rescue infantry from a fortified position. The bridge was a kill zone. The river was full of the drowned. He watched. He could only watch. The moment of total collapse is difficult to pinpoint precisely in historical terms. Battles rarely have clean turning points that everyone can agree on. But the killing of Grand Vizier Elmas Mehmed Pasha was clearly somewhere near the center of it. Elmas Mehmed had been, up until this point, the battlefield commander. The Sultan was the symbolic leader, the inspirational figurehead. The Grand Vizier was the man actually running the operational side of the army. And when things started going catastrophically wrong on the eastern bank, it was Elmas Mehmed who tried to maintain order, tried to organize resistance, tried to hold some kind of coherent defensive line. The Janissaries killed him. I want to be clear about what that means, because it's easy to read past it. The Janissaries were the Ottoman Empire's most elite soldiers. They were the backbone of the army. They were supposed to be the most disciplined, most professional unit on the entire battlefield. And in their panic and terror, they turned on their own commanding general and murdered him. That is not a unit that is still fighting. That is a unit that has completely broken. When soldiers start killing their own officers, the battle is over. What remains is the slaughter. And slaughtered they were. The Habsburg cavalry had cut off the bridge. Habsburg cavalry was also moving through the Ottoman camp itself. The massive logistical tail of the army, with its livestock, its supply wagons, its ammunition stores, its food. Soldiers who tried to flee north along the river ran into Starhemberg's flank column. Soldiers who tried to flee into the marshes found the terrain impassable. Soldiers who threw down their weapons and surrendered were, in the chaos, often cut down anyway. And thousands, the precise number is impossible to know, but the sources consistently say thousands, tried to swim across the Tisza in September, in cold, fast-moving water, in full military equipment, in a state of absolute physical and psychological exhaustion. According to imperial records, more than 10,000 men drowned. 10,000 men. Drowned. Not killed by weapons. Drowned in a river because there was nowhere else to run. There is a specific horror to a battle that ends in mass drowning that I think gets lost in the clinical language of military history. These weren't anonymous statistics. These were individual human beings. Young men, mostly, many of them probably conscripted or press-ganged into service, thousands of miles from their homes in Anatolia or the Balkans. And they died cold and alone, and terrified in a river in Hungary, because their commanders led them into an impossible position. War is brutal, but some battles are more brutal than others, and Zenta was a particular kind of brutal. As darkness fell on September 11, 1697, the eastern bank of the Tisza was unrecognizable. The Ottoman camp, which hours ago had been a functioning city of tents and cooking fires and military organization, was now an enormous wreck of broken equipment, dead horses, and human bodies. The Habsburg soldiers moved through it methodically. They captured the Ottoman artillery, every single cannon, every mortar, everything. They captured the massive supply train. They captured thousands of horses and livestock. They captured gold and silver. And they captured the Sultan's personal treasure chest. I find myself fixating on that detail every time I come back to this story. The Sultan's treasure chest. The physical, tangible symbol of Ottoman imperial wealth. The gold and jewels and documents that travelled with the Sultan as a representation of the empire itself, was now in the hands of a 33-year-old French-born general who had once been turned away by Louis XIV. Somewhere in that wreckage, hiding among the bodies of the dead, was a man named Imre Thököly. Thököly was a Hungarian nobleman who had led an anti-Habsburg uprising in the 1680s allied himself with the Ottomans, and spent the intervening years as a kind of Ottoman-backed pretender to the Hungarian throne. He'd arrived at Zenta as part of the Ottoman force, and when everything fell apart, he found himself trapped on the eastern bank with no way out. So he did the only thing he could think of. He found a pile of dead bodies, lay down among them, and didn't move. He stayed there for hours, surrounded by the dead, while Habsburg soldiers moved through the camp, searching for survivors to capture or kill. He waited until it was fully dark, and then, when he was reasonably confident he wouldn't be spotted, he slipped into the Tisza and swam across. He survived. He eventually made his way to Ottoman territory and spent the rest of his life in exile. But the image of him lying motionless among the dead, this man who had once dared to challenge the Habsburgs for control of Hungary, is, I think, a perfect metaphor for the state of the Ottoman cause after Zenta. Playing dead, waiting for the darkness, swimming away. By morning, it was over. The Habsburg army had, in approximately 3 hours of combat, inflicted somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 casualties on the Ottoman force. They had captured the entire Ottoman artillery train. They had captured the Sultan's treasury. They had killed or captured multiple senior Ottoman commanders. They had effectively destroyed the main field army of the Ottoman Empire's European theatre. Their own losses, approximately 429 soldiers killed, with roughly 1,500 wounded. The ratio of losses, 60 or 70 Ottoman deaths for every one Habsburg death, is almost incomprehensible. You simply don't see numbers like that in battles between professional armies of comparable quality. This wasn't a massacre of an untrained rabble. This was the destruction of one of the most powerful military forces on earth by a smaller enemy that was better led, better positioned, and better prepared. Eugene of Savoy had done the impossible. He had looked at 100,000 Ottoman soldiers and found the one moment, the one position, the one configuration in which they were vulnerable. And he had struck with absolute precision at the exact right time. If this story is getting to you the way it gets to me, the audacity, the tactical genius, the sheer drama of it, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps get this kind of deep dive history in front of more people. And subscribe if you haven't already. We've got a lot more stories like this one. Sultan Mustafa II fled south that night. The army that retreated with him was a ghost of what had crossed the Tisza just months before. Units were scattered. Officers were dead. The Janissaries, already politically volatile before Zenta, were now a barely controlled mob of traumatized, angry soldiers who had just murdered their own Grand Vizier. The morale of the Ottoman force was, to put it charitably, completely shattered. Mustafa fell back toward Timișoara, modern-day Romania, which was one of the last significant Ottoman strongholds in the region. He needed to put distance between himself and the Habsburg army. He needed time to regroup, to resupply, to figure out what had just happened. Eugene did not give him time. This is another aspect of Eugene's generalship that doesn't always get the attention it deserves: his ability to exploit a victory. Plenty of commanders in history have won a battle and then failed to turn that victory into strategic results because they were too cautious, too slow, or too focused on consolidating what they'd gained. Eugene was different. The day after Zenta, he was already planning the next move. With the Ottoman main force in full retreat and unable to offer organized resistance, Eugene turned his attention to Bosnia, a region that the Ottomans had held as a border province and that was now essentially undefended. He led his army into Bosnia in September and October of 1697, and the campaign was brutal and thorough. The city of Sarajevo was sacked and burned. This is not a footnote, and I don't think we should treat it as one. Sarajevo in 1697 was a significant Ottoman city, a regional center of trade, culture, and Muslim life. When Eugene's forces burned it, they were sending a message that went far beyond military strategy. They were demonstrating that the post-Zenta Ottoman Empire could no longer protect its own population centers. That the empire's reach, the physical protection it offered to the people living under it, was ending. For the people of Bosnia, of the Balkans, of the entire borderlands between Habsburg and Ottoman territory. Zenta and its aftermath changed the fundamental reality of their daily lives. The question was no longer whether the Ottomans or the Habsburgs would dominate this region. After Zenta, the answer was becoming clear. Back in Constantinople, the reaction was one of stunned horror. The news of Zenta arrived in the Ottoman capital like a physical blow. The magnitude of the disaster was almost incomprehensible to the people receiving the reports. An army of 100,000 men, with the Sultan himself present, had been essentially annihilated in an afternoon. The Grand Vizier was dead. The artillery was gone. The treasury was gone. The Sultan had fled. The political consequences inside the empire were immediate. Mustafa II, in a move that was becoming a depressing Ottoman tradition after military disasters, dismissed the senior commanders and looked for someone to blame. He appointed a new Grand Vizier, Amkazada Hussein Pasha, ironically, the same man who had correctly advised attacking Petrovaradin instead of pushing toward Transylvania. But even Hussein Pasha, able as he was, could not undo the damage. He understood that the empire needed peace, not more war. The Janissaries, already turbulent before Zenta, already a political force that sultans had to manage carefully rather than simply command, became even more dangerous in the aftermath. Thousands of demobilized soldiers flooded back into Constantinople, broke, angry, and looking for someone to blame. The social order of the capital itself was under strain. Meanwhile, the Ottoman fortresses that remained in Hungary and the Balkans were falling with barely a fight. The Ottoman garrisons that had held out for years against Habsburg pressure were now receiving no reinforcements, no supplies, no encouragement. The main army had been destroyed. The Sultan had run. There was nothing left to defend with. Zenta had done something that years of grinding, attritional warfare had failed to do. It had broken the will of the Ottoman military establishment, not permanently. The Ottomans would fight again, and there would be more wars in the 18th century. But the specific form of Ottoman power in Central Europe, the vision of a Muslim empire stretching from Constantinople to the heart of Hungary, that was over, finished, drowned in the Tisza River on an autumn afternoon. I want to say something here about the human cost that I think gets lost in the geopolitical analysis. Tens of thousands of men died at Zenta. Tens of thousands more were killed or displaced in the aftermath. In the sack of Sarajevo, in the final campaigns of the war. Families were destroyed. Communities were shattered. The Balkan borderlands, which had already been a zone of constant violence and displacement for decades, were convulsed again by the shock of the Ottoman collapse. History turns on battles. But battles are made of people, and the people who died at Zenta were as real as you or me. With the Ottoman main field army gone and the empire's European position crumbling, Mustafa II had no real choice. He had to negotiate. But how do you get an empire that has spent 3 centuries expanding? An empire whose entire political and cultural identity is built around conquest and expansion, to sit down at a table and formally admit defeat? This was not just a military problem. It was a profound psychological and political one. The Ottoman system had always resolved unfavorable situations through truces, temporary suspensions of hostilities that implied the war was merely paused, not ended. The Ottomans had never, in their entire European history, signed a peace treaty that acknowledged territorial loss. The Congress of Karlowitz, which opened in November 1698 and ran for 72 days, was going to be different. It had to be. The English and Dutch governments sent mediators, Lord William Paget for England, Jacob Collier for the Dutch Republic. This was itself a novelty. Neutral mediators, representing Protestant commercial powers, sitting in on negotiations between a Habsburg Catholic coalition and the Ottoman Sunni Empire. It tells you something about how thoroughly the old religious framework of these wars had been replaced by something more pragmatic, more modern, a diplomatic world organized around state interests rather than crusades. The Ottoman delegation tried, repeatedly, to limit the damage. They argued for this fortress and that province. They appealed to long-standing possession and customary rights. They stalled. They negotiated by exhaustion, as diplomats from weaker positions have always done. But the military reality was inescapable. The Habsburgs, energized by Zenta, holding the actual territory in question and represented by hard-nosed diplomats who knew exactly what they'd won, applied the principle of uti possidetis. Each party keeps what it currently holds. That principle, introduced by the neutral mediators, cut through all the Ottoman appeals to historical sovereignty. You have it, you keep it. Don't you have it, you don't get it back. On January 26, 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz was signed. The redistribution of territory was staggering. The Habsburgs received Hungary, effectively all of it, except for a corner in the southeast, along with Transylvania, Croatia, and Slavonia. We're talking about approximately 60,000 square miles of territory, an area larger than the state of Georgia, changing hands in a single document. Venice took most of Dalmatia and the entire Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece. Poland regained Podolia and parts of what is now Ukraine. Russia, in a separate negotiation that concluded with the Treaty of Constantinople in 1700, kept the port of Azov, its first significant foothold on the Black Sea. The Ottomans kept Belgrade. They kept the Banat of Temesvar. They kept their suzerainty over Wallachia and Moldavia. But Hungary, which they had held for a century and a half, which had been the crown jewel of their European empire, which Suleiman the Magnificent had conquered in 1526 in one of the most spectacular campaigns of the 16th century. Hungary was gone. Now here's the thing I want to emphasize about Karlowitz, because I think it's as important as the territorial changes themselves. This was the first time the Ottoman Empire signed a peace treaty. Not a truce, not an armistice, a peace treaty. They acknowledged defeat. They accepted defeat. They put their name on a document that said, in the diplomatic language of the time, that they had lost, that the other side had won, and that the new borders were legitimate and permanent. For an empire built entirely on the ideology of continuous expansion and divine favor, that was not a small thing. That was, symbolically, almost as devastating as the battlefield itself. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the empire that always won. It was now, officially, an empire that could be beaten, could be pushed back, could be forced to surrender territory it had held for generations. The Congress of Karlowitz also marked another first. The Ottomans accepted mediation by outside parties and negotiated simultaneously with a coalition of enemies. Before Karlowitz, Ottoman diplomatic practice had always been bilateral, to deal with each enemy separately, divide them if possible, and avoid any arrangement that treated the empire as one party among equals in a multilateral framework. Karlowitz forced them to abandon that approach entirely. In a very real sense, Karlowitz dragged the Ottoman Empire into the modern state system, the system of sovereign states, formal diplomacy, and recognized borders that was being constructed in Europe at precisely this moment in history. And it dragged them in as the losing party. I've seen some historians argue that Karlowitz's significance is overstated, that the Ottoman Empire wasn't really in terminal decline in 1699, that the decline narrative is too neat and too simple, that the empire actually continued to be a major power for another 2 centuries. And they're not entirely wrong. The Ottomans would fight again, and there would be more wars and more back and forth in the 18th century. The empire didn't collapse in 1699. But here's my counter. Sometimes the symbolic turning point matters, even if the reality is messier. Karlowitz announced to the world, and to the Ottomans themselves, that the era of Ottoman expansion was over. Even if that wasn't completely true in 1699, it became increasingly true as the decades passed. The trajectory was set. The direction was established, and the moment the direction was established, the decline became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Ottoman state that had conquered Constantinople, that had crushed Christian armies from Hungary to Persia, that had made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake, that state was, after Karlowitz, a state in retreat. It would take 200 years for the final collapse to come. But the direction of travel was set at a table in a small village in Serbia on January 26, 1699. And it was set because of what happened at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on September 11, 1697, when a 33-year-old general from Savoy decided to ignore his emperor's orders. History is full of battles that were decisive in the moment but faded into irrelevance within a generation. Zenta was the opposite. The consequences of those 3 hours on the Tisza River compounded across the decades and centuries in ways that are still shaping the world we live in. Let's start with the most immediate legacy, the Eastern Question. The phrase sounds archaic now, but for 19th century European diplomats, the Eastern Question was the defining geopolitical challenge of their era. It referred simply to this: what happens to the territories and people currently under Ottoman rule as the empire continues to weaken? Who fills the vacuum? Who gets the Balkans? Who controls the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean? The Eastern Question was born at Karlowitz. The moment the Ottoman Empire started losing territory in Europe, a power vacuum began forming in southeastern Europe, and into that vacuum, Austria and Russia both started reaching. The clash of Austrian and Russian interests in the Balkans through the 18th and 19th centuries, always at Ottoman expense, always feeding on the empire's slow decline, is one of the defining stories of modern European history. And if you follow that thread far enough forward, you end up in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914, where the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in the very city that Eugene of Savoy had sacked 217 years earlier, triggered the First World War. I'm not going to draw a straight causal line from Zenta to World War I. History doesn't work that cleanly, but the connection is real. The power dynamics of the Balkans that made 1914 so explosive, the competing nationalisms, the Austrian anxiety about Slavic independence movements, the Russian pan-Slavic ambitions, the dying Ottoman state and its desperate attempts to maintain relevance, all of it was downstream of the post-Karlowitz reshaping of southeastern Europe. Zenta started a chain of consequences that stretched forward for more than 2 centuries. Then there's Eugene himself. Zenta was not the end of Eugene of Savoy's story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. The reputation he established at Zenta made him the most respected military commander in Europe, and over the following decades, he used that reputation to extraordinary effect. In the War of the Spanish Succession, he partnered with the Duke of Marlborough, and together they inflicted some of the most crushing defeats in French history. Battles like Blenheim in 1704 and Oudenarde in 1708. Later, he fought the Ottomans again and won at Petrovaradin in 1716 and at Belgrade in 1717, actually capturing that city that had eluded him in 1697. Eugene of Savoy died in 1736 at the age of 72, having spent 50 years as one of the most consequential soldiers in European history. He never married. He had no children. He spent his private life as a collector of art and books, building the Belvedere Palace in Vienna, one of the most beautiful Baroque structures in Europe, as a monument to his own achievement. And somewhere in that palace, I imagine, he thought occasionally about the young man who had been turned away by Louis XIV, the boy with the scandalous mother and the unfortunate nose who wasn't good enough for the French army, the man who saved Europe from Ottoman domination and then turned around and broke France's domination on the battlefield too. There's a counterfactual that I think is genuinely important. What if Eugene had obeyed his orders? This is not a trivial question. The orders were clear. The prudential arguments for caution were real. Engaging a larger army when your emperor has explicitly told you not to is not obviously the right call, even in retrospect. Military history is full of generals who disobeyed orders and got their armies destroyed. If the Ottoman army had completed its crossing and the battle had never happened, Habsburg Austria, already strained by the 9 Years' War in the West, might have been forced to accept a compromise peace that left a significant Ottoman presence in Hungary. The course of the entire Great Turkish War might have been different. The fact that Eugene's gamble paid off at the ratio of 60-1 doesn't vindicate every risky, order-defying decision in history. But it does tell you something about Eugene specifically. He didn't just disobey orders. He disobeyed orders because he had correctly analyzed the situation and correctly calculated the odds. That's not recklessness, that's genius. The final lesson I take from Zenta, and this is genuinely something I believe, is about the relationship between institutions and individuals. The Ottoman Empire at Zenta was a massive, powerful, resource-rich institution that failed catastrophically because its institutional systems, intelligence gathering, tactical adaptability, command flexibility, had atrophied. The Habsburg army at Zenta was smaller, poorer, and less prestigious, but it had one thing the Ottomans didn't: a commander who could see clearly, think quickly, and act decisively. Institutions matter, resources matter, numbers matter. But sometimes one person, in one moment, at one critical juncture, can tip the scales that all the institutional advantages in the world cannot hold steady. Eugene of Savoy was that person, at that moment, at that juncture. And the scales have been tipped ever since. Let me bring you back to the Tisza River one more time. The morning after the battle, September 12th, 1697. The river was still running. It always runs. Rivers don't stop for battles, don't pause for empires, don't mourn the tens of thousands of people their currents carried away the night before. The Tisza ran that morning the same way it runs today, cold and brown and indifferent, past the reeds and the marshes and the small town of Zenta. But everything else was different. The Ottoman camp was a ruin. The bridge was gone. The artillery, dozens of cannon that had been dragged hundreds of miles from Constantinople, sat silent in Habsburg hands. The treasure chest of Sultan Mustafa II, packed with gold and documents and the symbols of empire, was being inventoried by Habsburg soldiers. And somewhere in Timisoara, a sultan was trying to explain to his court how 100,000 soldiers had been destroyed in an afternoon. Mustafa II would reign for 6 more years, but he was never the same. He was deposed in 1703 and died shortly after, a man who had staked everything on reversing history and found that history doesn't reverse, it turns. Eugene of Savoy received a hero's welcome back in Vienna. Emperor Leopold I, the same man who had ordered Eugene not to fight, celebrated the victory with all the enthusiasm of a man who had been entirely in favor of it all along. That's politics. Eugene smiled and accepted the honors and went back to work. He had 39 more years ahead of him. 39 more years of battles and campaigns and victories that would cement his place as one of the greatest soldiers who ever lived. But none of them, I think, not Blenheim, not Oudenarde, not Belgrade, none of them had the sheer, compressed, cinematic perfection of that autumn afternoon on the Tisza. The hidden march through the swamps, the captured Pasha and his fatal intelligence, the courier from Vienna with the orders not to fight, and then the cannons at 5 o'clock, and the bridge collapsing, and an empire's future drowning in a river in Hungary. September 11th, 1697. The day a smaller army destroyed a larger one. The day a general ignored his emperor and changed the world. The day the Ottoman tide, 350 years in the making, finally, decisively, irreversibly broke. That's the story of Zenta. If you made it all the way through this one, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought. Did Eugene make the right call, defying the emperor's orders? Was Mustafa II a tragic figure or just a bad strategist? I want to hear your take. And if you want more stories like this, battles that changed everything, commanders who defied the odds, moments where the world pivoted on a single decision, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.